Necessity is the plea for every infringement of human freedoms. It's the argument of tyrants. It's the creed of slaves. Behold the tyrants in your local city councils, in your state capitals, and in the faces of your federal officials. Tyrants haven't changed at all in the 240 years since William Pitt spoke those words. The creed of the tyrant is as old as human nature and just as dark. Those who are handed power or those who take it by force will always find a reason, an excuse, a cause, a rationale to take away your rights. It is their raison d'etre. For the more rights they can take, the more power they are given, and power is an intoxicating nectar to those with weak characters and dubious honor. Authoritarianism is never a good look except to those wearing it. Tragically, there have been millions who have had to pay for the psychological need of the despot to purify an imperfect earth with blood and fire. But we never seem to learn that we cannot appease these people. Their lust for dominance, their desire to micromanage our lives becomes even more horrifying as we witness the birth of technology that makes their job of control that much easier. The West that we are living in is not merely the consequence of surrender, but of conquest. But what is the difference if both paths lead to domination and subjugation? The difference is that the former is guaranteed serfdom because surrender to evil is, by very definition, preemptive failure and acquiescence to evil. But resistance at least allows us to fight back on the basis of some pretty fabulous tenets, such as honor, truth, and freedom. It may be too late at this point, but that's inconsequential. We have a duty to fight for our countries and for future generations, and we instinctively know this. Good people know this. My name is Ellie, and I was sworn in as a peace officer in 1999, and I worked for the federal government in this capacity. The oath I swore was an oath to protect society first and foremost, and it was one I took very seriously. And it requires me to protect the public even from a tyrannical government, which is what we are seeing right now. I need to speak out about what I see as the end goal of this because this is not about a virus that is merely being used by the government. Their goal is as old as time itself. It is about power, and it is about destroying freedom and controlling every aspect of your life, including your medical freedom. It's about obliterating the middle class, collapsing the economy, and putting us under the boot of global government. They're also testing to see what we will accept from our overlords. And there is only one solution. The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. When I was growing up, I loved two things, freedom and truth. But as I got older, I realized two things. One, we don't have real freedom. Freedoms that respect our inalienable rights and freedoms that give us autonomy over our lives, our health, our bodies, our property, our speech, our thought, freedom of movement, freedom of association, for good or bad. And two, people don't want or like truth. In fact, like petulant children, most embrace truth only when it is beneficial to them or when it conforms with their limited worldview. If truth is antagonistic to their beliefs and or it's going to require action and quite possibly see them ostracized or ridiculed, demeaned, or thrown out of polite society, then they don't want to hear it. If truth is too horrible to face, they will turn their back on it gladly, gleefully, and without regret or shame. Most don't have the burning fire of liberty alight in their veins. And even if they do, a cold dose of reality usually puts it out. I think it's fair to say the tyrants have taken off their masks. They've declared by deed and word their intentions. People's rights have been decimated. They are reduced to misbehaving children locked in their bedrooms for their ill deeds. Come out of that room, young man, and you'll wish you hadn't, Daddy Government screams. Tyrants are powerless if the masses choose not to give them power. No one leads if no one follows. Sort of like evil that feeds off of fear and grows stronger because of it. So this is where we sit right now, a once proud and free people begging through our face masks to be enslaved. We have seen the public throw aside their mistrust and contempt for their local, state, and federal government and sit glued to their screens and await their orders. And even the dissenters are still asking for their freedoms back rather than taking them. But I have seen a lot of good people give in to the fear churned out by the corporate and state broadcasters. But a state of perpetual fear impairs your immune function, inhibits cognitive thought, it paralyzes, it can lead to paranoia and isolation. But fear is a strong motivator, and many want to be led and have the state as guardians of the flock, even knowing that the shepherd they choose will saddle up with the wolves and the foxes to guard the henhouse. But still they hand over their freedoms without force. The only payment they require is safety. security. The false lullaby of the liar, wooing you to sleep with promises and soft words. Sleep tight in your bed and pretend that the room isn't on fire around you. Those who have eyes to see understand that this destructive force has been brought in intentionally. It is this force that has worked to undermine our entire civilization and has masterfully destroyed a once cohesive and moral people. Do you ever go out in public and wonder at the ever-increasing shuffling mass of humanity, resplendent in their pajamas, their mouths agape, seeming not to notice their disheveled appearance or their distended stomachs straining and testing the elastic band of their pajama bottoms? No, they're too busy slobbering at the prospect of cheap Chinese goods at their local Walmart stores. They pile greasy GMO goo into their already bloated and distorted faces and those of their offspring. They are the new consumer, giddy at the prospect of purchasing things they don't need at prices they can't afford from corporations that are busy working against their best interests. Most have a little jingle in their jeans from the government they claim to despise, but free goods go a long way to help melt away bitter resentment. And let's face it, most of them don't hate the government. They aren't informed enough to hate. What they do hate is that the government isn't putting enough restrictions, enough taxes, and enough sanctions in place to enslave them even more, because the one thing they really hate is themselves. Their self-loathing is blatant and nauseating. It is also so sad that one's heart aches. They have been targeted and despised in a special way, ensuring not just their destruction, but their self-destruction. For it is a special kind of annihilation that is wrought from one's own hand. Our men laboring under this constant black cloud that sees them ridiculed, maligned, and despised in societies that their forefathers built. This self-hatred cannot be achieved overnight, but has come through a century of careful planning by a group that will stop at nothing to destroy what we value, and so far has achieved smashing success. They laugh when they see this group of people, our people, who have become these pathetic, masochistic nihilists who beg to pick up the whip with which to self-flagellate on the altar of political correctness and self-denigration. What we know for sure is that a masochist will always find a sadist who will gladly degrade them. The animated corpse is ripe with bloat, but they pretend that it is the rotund health. I am not saying this to be cruel. I am saying it out of pity for these people and out of pure righteous indignation at those that did it. We need to call out this wickedness and tell them we will accept it no more, for power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And it is our willingness to accept their wickedness that gives them the green light to continue. However, our biggest threat going forward may not be the government, but our fellow citizens. History is rife with examples of people who submitted to tyrants at the expense of their fellow men. What we have now in the 21st century is multiple generations inactive through cowardice or inability, frozen into compliance, knowing the cost but willing to pay it if only the specter of social shaming would pass them by. For it would be far better to sacrifice their future progeny than to bear the unfathomable burden of being called a name, publicly shamed, punished, having the audacity to think for themselves, and be naughty enough to engage in civil disobedience. But fear can often show a person's true colors. There is an ever-growing number of people that know this is not about a virus. That is not the disease that ails us. We do suffer from one, however, and that is the disease of modern man, having lost their humanity, and most of society has become infected. We could say that people are infected with the 2 Timothy virus, and if that virus were confined to a single limb, so to speak, it would be easy enough to amputate that appendage and learn to live without it. The truth is that the decay has been allowed to infect the entire body, a rotting corpse that is animated by evil, seemingly alive, but no longer having a will of its own. We gave the implicit nod of approval through our own inaction. Maybe it would be more accurate to state that we watched our leaders, our public servants, our churches and schools welcome the disease through the front door while we turned our backs and silently crept out the back door, hoping someone would stay behind to do the fight that we just weren't willing to do. We have become jaded because we understand that the fish rots from the head down, and we know the entire establishment is rotten to the core. Speaking of the establishment, let's take a moment and analyze their reaction to this pandemic. Let's start with our frontline workers. Do any of these people appear to be responding to a life-threatening pandemic? Or does it seem more like a Broadway play about first responders? And what about our police?
Quick, take our advice if you may not get sick. Stay at home whenever you can. Don't go out on the streets with your fam. Don't walk around in 2 or more, or we'll come knocking at your door. Only go to the shop for essential things like bread, milk, fruit and cheese drinks. Go stretch your legs, but only one time. Do as we say or you might get a fine.
sounds like a bad rap from the 80s. Does that seem like an appropriate response to a pandemic that is so serious, supposedly, that they have shut down all of the schools and the vast majority of businesses across the Western world? Estimates are that more than 17 million are unemployed in the US, the highest number in the history of the country. Amazon also dug the knife in, cutting their affiliate program. In some areas, it went from 8% down to 3%, and groceries went down to a measly 1%. All the while, Bozos has made an extra $24 billion during the crisis. These are the corporations we are helping to elevate while we kill small business and push our neighbors onto social assistance. Now, I'm not going to discuss it during this video, but let's not forget about the Cloward-Piven strategy of overloading the system. But surely we can trust our health officials, right? During the swine flu, the World Health Organization stated that up to 7 million would die without the vaccine they were pushing. The CDC states that while there were approximately 60.8 million cases, there were only 12,469 deaths. And why would they inflate the numbers in such a way? Well, when you consider that only 25% of the World Health Organization's funding comes from member states and the other 75% comes from contributions from such benevolent organizations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In 1999, the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly concluded that there was, quote, overwhelming evidence that the seriousness of the pandemic vastly overrated by the World Health Organization, and that the drug industry had influenced the organization's decision-making. Yet no one bats an eye when the same World Health Organization screams about millions will die, shut down the economy, we need a vaccine. Oh, what's that? You don't want the vaccine? Well, there'll be a cozy room in some far-off place for people like you, and the public will cheer. You know those snitch lines they've set up everywhere? Yes, those will come in handy for dissidents like you. The Bible talks about a time when people will kill you and think they are doing God's work. But that can only happen in a world where good is evil and evil is good, where men have lost their moral way and judgment has fallen to the wayside, where helping your neighbor and giving selflessly to your community is gone. Welcome to 2020. Right on cue, the Department of Health and Human Services has submitted a declaration to provide immunity for activities relating to medical countermeasures. In other words, when the vaccine comes out, there will be no liability. But don't worry, the government is here to protect you from medical dangers. Why the FBI raided a clinic that was providing high-dose intravenous vitamin C to people to boost their immune system. Why, this doctor even had the nerve to provide the treatment for free if his clients couldn't afford it. It took 12 FBI agents to raid the clinic. That's your tax dollars hard at work. But you see, they think you're too stupid to decide your own treatment and your own path to healing. The government will only approve those methods that are endorsed by the bought and paid for, completely corrupt World Health Organization and CDC. Post numos or follow the money. Your answer will always be there. And the money always leads back to the Federal Reserve that we know is not federal and they have no reserves. So James Bullard, who is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, has stated that we may need to look at COVID-19 testing where people get tested every day and they would wear a badge which shows their immune response. Now, as far as the Trump administration goes, the two main faces that we're seeing during this crisis is Fauci and Birx. Now, it was Fauci in 2010 that was on the Leadership Council for the Global Vaccine Action Plan with Bill and Mel Gates, the World Health Organization, and UNICEF. Now, you don't get more wicked and vile than that. Anything related to the United Nations is evil. And Birx was appointed by former President Barack Obama to serve as U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator in 2014. She served on the board of the Global Fund, which has received more than $2 billion in funding from the Bill and Mel Gates Foundation. Now, Birx is garnering criticism for touting a disputed model for the virus outbreak prepared by the University of Washington's IHME, a project of the Gates Foundation. Now, we know that Bill Gates said he supported using immunity IDs. He said, quote, eventually we will have some digital certificates to show who has recovered or been tested recently, or when we have a vaccine, who has received it. And Fauci told CNN that immunity cards are possible. He stated, and I quote, I mean, it's one of those things that we talk about when we want to make sure we know who the vulnerable people are and are not. This is something that's being discussed. I think it might actually have some merit under certain circumstances. I was at the grocery store 2 days ago, and I was speaking with an employee there who had been visited by the police that morning at his home. And they gave him a typed letter on police letterhead, and it stated that he had permission to leave his home so that he could go to work. Does anyone have a problem with that? Does that sound like a free country where you need police permission to leave your home? Now, the UK has recently passed Bill HC-122, an emergency coronavirus bill. It passed on March 25th, and it states that anyone can be detained indefinitely. Authorities can take samples from you without your consent. Lockdowns will be enforced, can last up to 2 years. You can be detained for treatment under the Mental Health Act. Personal wishes can be ignored and cremations enforced. There will be no inquest into suspicious deaths. The NHS will be excused from neglect. And one medical officer can sign a compulsory treatment order, meaning you can be forced medicated or vaccinated. Now let's go across the ocean to Canada. On April 1st, Trudeau pushed through a 50% increase in carbon taxes. He also is forcing the taxpayers to pay for an $8 million renovation on his home, and he also gave the government a nice big fat raise, all during the worst unemployment scourge on record. And why is there high unemployment? Because of the measures that he took. The legislation that he pushed through grants the government extraordinary new powers to spend, borrow, and tax without having to get the approval of opposition MPs for 6 months. This gives the government sweeping new powers to spend money and raise taxes without having to get the approval of Parliament. 6 months ago, the Canadian electorate decided the Liberals should not have a majority government. Their minority status requires them to work with opposition parties to pass legislation. It's unfortunate the Liberals have used a health pandemic to give themselves powers Canadians didn't vote for and the Liberals have not earned. Meanwhile, in Ontario, Canada, a 72-year-old retired man took his little dog out to go to do a bathroom break, and he was fined $880 by the Sarnia, Ontario police. They did come back, however, to tell him that they had good news. They were going to cancel that $880 ticket for this elderly man, and they did. They canceled it and instead gave him one for $1,255 for allegedly violating the Quarantine Act because he had the audacity to take his dog, Molly, out into an abandoned park to go to the bathroom. In the States, we've seen a brother and sister have police called on them for doing yard work. In Hawaii, you can have a $5,000 fine or 1 year in jail for being on the beach and sunbathing. Boston suburb fines $100 for anyone walking in the wrong direction. Wisconsin town allows residents as young as 12 to be fined for violating the stay-at-home order. There was a couple that got married and jailed on the same day because they weren't social distancing. And a Colorado father was handcuffed in front of his 6-year-old daughter for playing t-ball with his wife and kids in an empty park. Now, we've all heard that California is releasing 3,500 inmates, and you can bet the people who are out walking their dogs, sunbathing, and lifting weights are going to be replacing them. New York has also released inmates. An accused rapist was released from Rikers Island and was arrested for allegedly raping a woman in Brooklyn days later. We've heard the head of Indiana's Family and Social Services say that calls to mental health and suicide prevention hotlines have risen from 1,000 per day to 25,000 per day, and calls to addiction hotlines has risen dramatically as well. Domestic violence is rising. In France, they rose 32% in a single week. Now, the hysteria swung into full gear when Neil Ferguson of the Imperial College came out with another overblown model that stated that 2.2 million will die in the US and 500,000 in the UK. I say another overblown model because it was the same man who, because of his faulty model in 2001 during the foot and mouth outbreak in the UK, convinced Tony Blair to have 12 million animals slaughtered, and the farming community was devastated by suicides and bankruptcies. It's a decision that cost £10 billion. And then 2002, he predicted that mad cow disease would kill 50,000 people. It killed 178. In 2005, Ferguson said that up to 200 million people could die from bird flu. In the end, only 78 people died. 4 years later, in 2009, Ferguson and his Imperial team predicted that swine flu had a case fatality rate of 0.3% to 1.5%. A government estimate, based on Ferguson's advice, said a reasonable worst-case scenario would lead to 65,000 UK deaths. In the end, swine flu killed 457 people in the UK and had a death rate of just 0.026% in those infected. Fast forward to 2020, and we see Western leaders have chose to believe his pandemic modeling once more, and we have shut down the entire Western world because of them. Actually, we shut down our world because our leaders told us to, and we let them. We chose obedience over freedom. We chose acquiescence over our children's future. Now, Ferguson became an advisor to the World Bank, and that alone should tell you something. And on March 12th, he sent a letter to Macron stating that 500,000 French would die from the virus if nothing was done. That very night, the lockdowns began. It was also Ferguson who stated publicly on March 16th that as many as 550,000 British and 1.2 million Americans would die from the virus. But far from being duped, our leaders were in on the conspiracy the whole time. Not only did they not close the borders as one would expect if a real pandemic was raging, but they made off like bandits with our money. Trump was able to push through a stimulus bill without your input, one that gives 95% of the money to causes and groups that have nothing to do with the American people. We use words like billion and trillion all the time, but let's put this in perspective. Now, counting from 1 to 1 million requires you to say 13,198,003 syllables, and counting at 4.32 syllables per second, it would take 3,055,093 seconds to complete. And if you counted 16 hours a day, it would take 53 days or 1.7 months to complete. Doing the same math, counting from 1 to 1 billion would take 82,429.6 days or 225.8 years to complete. Now, counting from 1 to 1 trillion at 16 hours a day, it would take 115,445,290.1 days or 316,288 and a half years to complete. Now, think about how much money was just taken from the people and given away for refugee resettlement to nonprofits and big business, while your great-grandchildren will still be paying for it long after you're gone. They stole your money, and the amount was so large that it would take you over 700,000 years to count it. They didn't ask you. This is the largest transfer of wealth from the people to the rich in the history of the world. Enjoy your $1,200. Despite the fact that many are waking up to the fact that the emperor has no clothes, they are pushing full steam ahead. Just last week, 20 world leaders and global health figures held the first New World Order virtual COVID-19 response meeting run by the French President Emmanuel Macron and the population control eugenicist Bill Gates. Now let's be clear, Macron was selected, not elected, for a time such as this, and having Bill Gates waiting in the wings with his syringe and digital ID for every person on Earth is a match made in hell. Now, some have been warning for years and even decades about the impending jackboot on the neck of society. It has been obvious for those with eyes to see. With every law they passed to restrict your freedom, few were concerned because it didn't affect them at the time. But each law, each act, each bill, each motion, each resolution, each non-binding global pact was like a ticking time bomb, one silently marking off the years until 0 hour, unnoticed by all, save a few ridiculed souls. The bail-in legislation, the Quarantine Act, the brainwashing in the schools from kindergarten to grad, taking us off the gold standard, taking us off food-based nutrition and onto chemical poison, the xenoestrogens, the fluoride, the spyware, GMOs, 5G, smart meter, the vaccines, the Codex Alimentarius, geoengineering, social engineering, the welfare state, illegal immigration, heck, mass legal immigration, hate speech laws, promoting immorality, specific and grotesque discrimination against Europeans, the attack on masculinity. Many are willing victims of the vampiric government who promise them crumbs as they gorge themselves on the fruits of our labor. With communities destroyed and families ripped apart, and with the people weak and demoralized, we were easy targets. When the people have no God but themselves, they will sacrifice to the God of self and feed it by any means necessary. Those without any pride or any sense of duty or self-worth will willingly grovel to keep their meaningless lives. if it means turning in their neighbor, standing in line for food to enter a near-empty store, or losing their career and livelihood for an illness with a 0.1% mortality rate, they'll do it. They'll like it. In fact, they won't even question it. This attack on humanity has had two objectives. One, to make us too dumbed down, too poor, too sickly, too effeminate, too demoralized, and too immoral to fight back. If there are no moral absolutes, if there is no standard of propriety and decency, if moral relativism is the name of the game, then a society couldn't possibly unite against perceived wrongs. Not only would they not be able to agree on what is wrong, as their moral compass would be broken, but their self-serving nature would inhibit any battle that required any level of self-sacrifice. 2, to slowly acclimate the people to their own serfdom. Redefine what it means to be free. Redefine the role of government. Put people in a perpetual state of fear, bondage, and debt. There is no move you cannot make without needing a license, a permit, regulatory laws, restrictions, duties, tariffs, and standards from the local to the federal level. It is all being done for a future time of global tyranny. That time is now. We aren't just being ordered to shelter in place, stay in our homes, forego human contact and connections. No, we're being ushered into a world of corporate control, with small businesses being decimated and multinational corporations being the only game in town. We're being forced to accept unemployment rates higher than the Great Depression, our fellow citizens turning in despair to drugs and alcohol, people losing their humanity and fearing their fellow man, and, in the end, a devalued dollar and hyperinflation. All this to protect us from the cootie bug. We have all been trained to respond to government demands like seals, and the circus show has started. Our ancestors certainly didn't need to be cooed into blissful calm by the black-souled government officials, promising safety for the low, low price of your freedom. They are building a police state right before our eyes. With our permission, no, with our express demand. We are throwing our rights at the feet of the bloated government and demanding they destroy our child's future over fear of a virus. Really. What we are witnessing in 2020 is not the imaginings of a single tyrant. It's not the creation of a group of despots in the 21st century that are eager to enslave us all. They are there, to be sure, in the background, eager to take center stage as the villain in the history books. But this is a centuries-long ambition, the path laid out stone by stone through the ages by those tyrants who came before and those yet to come. Our current leaders, eager to sit on the throne and rule over a united world, are merely trying to complete the circle that previous men have drawn for them. And I do say a circle, for it's clear that we're not traversing down a path, but rather a large enclosed ring. Their belief is that we can slow down or speed up the pace, keep going forward or turn around, but the end result will be the same. The beginning is the end, and the end is the beginning. We started in slavery, and it has always been their intention that we end in slavery. What we are seeing is what we call globalism, but globalism is a tidy word for world tyranny with a capital T. This has been their goal since the dawn of mankind. It is slavery with nowhere to run. We know that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And with one government head ruling over the entire world, that leaves no doubt as to the outcome. But let's also be clear as to the road traveled. The tyranny wasn't taken by force. No war was fought for the fate of the masses, no seizing of power. Our freedom was given away, a voluntary transfer of liberty for domination by an autocratic ruler. It is easy to control those who are disenfranchised, sick and poor and without direction. Those empty buckets waiting to be filled with something, and government is more than willing to dump in the poison. Those who take power by force are less dangerous than those who are given it by the people. When the people thrust their rights into the hands of a ruler, they become accomplices. They work against their fellow man. The bonds of community and brother are broken. I am far more saddened when I see members of my city applauding their shackles. That affects me infinitely more than the news that my government is restricting my rights. The latter I expect, the former attests to the fact that we have fallen far. I would argue it is a combination, a symmetry made in hell and perfected through the ages, one seized upon by the tyrant, the minority's desire to dominate combined with the masses' desire to be dominated. If you want to be taken care of from cradle to grave, there are people who will gladly oblige. Just be careful, because the cost will be your soul. Our journey isn't the journey of a lifetime, but the journey of centuries of men and women who thought they were free agents. The sudden moves by the elite may seem abrupt, but it's been planned and orchestrated for a very long time. This is the result of ruler after ruler, chosen behind the scenes by the elite down through the ages in order to fulfill their end goal. Each laid the groundwork for what we are witnessing today. Each rolled out the red carpet for those to come. But it was the people who allowed this to happen, and it will be the people who decide if it will continue. For no one can terrorize a whole nation unless we are all his accomplices. And we are all accomplices to some degree, aren't we? After all, we have neatly packaged our rights, resplendent with a big shiny bow, and handed them over to our rulers. Those rights, those inalienable rights, cannot be taken any more than our right to breathe can be taken without force. Imagine how duped, how naive, how stupid you would have to be to cheer on the closing of small businesses in your city or town while large corporations are prospering. How wicked do you have to be to call the authorities on your neighbor for leaving their house? How misguided you have to be to enforce unconstitutional laws. Imagine arresting a mother in the park, there with her young children, and still believing that you are one of the good guys. History has shown us time and time again that much more evil is committed by those obeying the laws than those breaking them. Let us remember that democide, or death by government, has killed 262 million in the last century. Government is the problem, it's not the solution. In closing, we are living in extraordinary times, and we need pushback now. Rome is about to burn, and while the government is fiddling, half the public is dancing and the other half is holding the sheet music. Now I am confident that there are a large number of decent men and women who do not fall into this category. Christian men who have been true watchmen on the wall and who have been sounding the alarm for years or decades. It doesn't take a majority to change the course we are on. It only takes a dedicated and organized minority. Because for the few who are willing to stand up in times like this, they have so much more substance, honor, wisdom, and truth inside of them that each one is worth thousands of sheep. I hope you will join me on this journey. See, I have no one in my personal life that can see through the lies and deception, and I imagine I'm not alone. This isn't really about trying to wake people up. I've been trying to do that for a couple of decades now, and I have failed abysmally. See, I've always been in the 1% standing against the 99%, and it's not an enviable position. I am tired. Swimming against the current is exhausting. That is why coming together in the virtual world is so important right now. We all need to find like-minded individuals, have a conversation, find truth, discuss options, and keep updated on what is going on, and if possible, organize and find allies. Remember that circle we're traveling on? Well, we get to decide what that end looks like. We can and must divert the course, make a new one, get off the well-worn circular path, and decide our own way. So far we have been the mule, chasing the carrot that we can never reach. But we are more fearful of that whip from our masters than we are of the monotonous and pointless journey. I believe that difficult times are ahead, but I also believe that suffering is the beginning of wisdom. We either pay the toll or fight the toll masters. There is no third option. We've been silent too long, and our silence has been taken for consent and weakness. But their baby steps into tyranny are turning into giant leaps, and we no longer have the option of remaining silent. There is always a line that cannot be crossed in the fight for the human condition, and when that line is reached, there are only two outcomes: enslavement or victory. This is Unapologetic Wasp reminding you to stay safe and stay true to yourself. Liberty is not for sale, and freedom is not something the tyrant can take. It is only something that you can give away. Take care.